been listening to Andy Burnham, who's effectively Britain's Prime Minister in waiting, giving what's billed as his first major policy speech there in Manchester. I'm still joined by Terry Stiasny. Terry, look, he started off there sounding a bit like somebody speaking to their hometown girlfriend after going to university and saying, I'll never forget you. But 10 minutes in, he sort of went from talking about sort of nothing really to talking about everything. Huge amount of ambition there, quite specific ambition, not so much about how to get it done, let alone how to pay for it.
Yeah, I thought it was a very crunchy speech. It had a lot of policy, a lot of, talking about exactly what was wrong with the country, how it was going to be improved in quite sort of think tanky policy terms about how government works and where it doesn't work. This wasn't sort of high-flying rhetoric appealing to voters. I mean, we were talking earlier, Hugo, about who was this speech really for. And I felt that this was a speech very much for practitioners, for people in government, for MPs, for civil servants, for people working in local authorities, as, talking about the powers that they had and what they were going to do. And I thought there was quite an interesting chunk there which was specifically aimed at Labour MPs, who are, after all, the people who will decide if Andy Burnham's going to be Prime Minister, saying that Parliament was full of good people working hard every day, but they didn't have enough power because of things being so over-centralised, that people were fragmented, disjointed, unhappy when he talked to people when he got back to Westminster, and saying that MPs need to not have the whips, use fear and close down debate. So that was kind of the pitch to the Labour MPs, but then talking about, the importance of place and the importance of growth. And one of the other things that he did, make sure to mention was sound finances and the discipline of current fiscal rules, which of course people will be looking out for.
There was, firstly, there was the shout out to Number 10 North. Now get this, he said before he mentioned Number 10 North, which he called the nerve centre of a rewired Britain. I've got to be honest, I still don't really understand what he means.
I don't entirely understand what he means, and I think, the metaphors, he's talking about conduits and nerve centres and what will this actually do. But I think, essentially the argument is, what he said after that was he wants government agencies to be supportive of local authorities. And he said he'd had 10 years of fighting the Whitehall machine and that this wasn't going to be how things worked anymore. And the Number 10 North seems to be going to be tasked with making changes, reforming utilities, for instance, reindustrialisation, regeneration. So, but he did also, as we were talking about earlier, say this is not just for Manchester. This will be based here, but we want power to flow to, the West, the Midlands, or the Southwest, or the East of England as well. So there were also shout-outs for other parts of the economy and other parts of the country.
There was also something there about basically safeguarding vital industries, talking about energy, food, defence, farming. Basically saying we're not just buying stuff, but buying British. That sounded, it was quite a sort of blue Labour vibe for a moment there.
Yes, I think that was interesting about resilience and about defence. And I think, he is particularly, perhaps he didn't, again, say this in terms, but he's thinking about things like defence spending, but also, if you would talk about, the kind of hybrid attacks that we've seen on the country and trying to make us more resilient, without trying to scare people too much. But it was interesting that he brought that in.
Look, Terry, stick with us. We're also joined now by Ollie Cole, the Times... Ollie, I'm going to park you for a moment. We're just going to dive in with Patrick Maguire first, because Patrick is he's the Times' chief political commentator, and he was in the room in Manchester, and he joins us now. Hello, Patrick.
Hello, Hugo.
What's it like? Are you walking on sunshine?
Am I walking on sunshine? No, I'm walking on a bridge over a canal in Manchester, Hugo, as befits the new order of things in British politics.
You're going to be spending a lot of time up there. Look, that was quite a speech. He was highly critical of SW1 and promises that Manchesterism would deliver good growth for every postcode. Very ambitious. Did we get enough there on how he's going to do all this?
No, but I think the prerequisite of any political project is setting out the terms and naming your enemies and setting the rhetorical frame. It's of course true that all of Britain's economic problems can't be traced back to its political culture, but that's the case Andy Burnham is trying to make, right? He's the guy that's going to come down and change the way British politics is done. I think it was a subtler speech, and perhaps a less straightforwardly left-wing one than some people might give it credit for. I think, if you listen to what he was saying, for instance, about the partnership with the private sector in Manchester, with, there were repeated references to sound public finances. As much as he spoke in sort of slightly happy-clappy terms about abolishing the whip, there was a very pointed line slipped in there almost imperceptibly where he said, "My political direction will not be up for negotiation." So, there was a lot in there. There was a lot on the why and the what, less on the how. But, that has set out the fundamentals and the frame for the Premiership we're about to get.
What are you expecting from the new number 10 in the North? Because he put that at the heart of the speech, and he sounds like he really means it. But that means the expectations are high. If it turns out to be a porter cabin in a car park, people are going to be pretty disappointed.
Well, he said it would be responsible for three things: driving regeneration, taking public control of utilities, and a third thing, which I'll be honest with you, Hugo, I've already forgotten. But rest assured, it was important. So look, it's a sort of the department for. I wonder whether, to an extent, it is. It's a threat to the Treasury as much as anything else, because that is the department that will be taking big decisions about driving regional growth, regeneration, the stuff that will cut across the grain of conventional Whitehall thinking. So, lots of Labour governments have thought about this before. John Prescott had a super department under Blair, obviously based out of Whitehall. Harold Wilson had the Department for Economic Affairs. It seems to be, one of those departments actually dressed up as an outpost of number 10 in the North. Because if you look at, just take the nationalisation, the regeneration, those are not nationalisation. Sorry, I can hear my phone vibrating with Andy Burnham's team. Public control of utilities. Those are things that cut across the grain of conventional Treasury thinking as much as anything. It's not really number 10 thing. It's a sort of, shifting the locus of economic power and strategy in government as much as anything else.
I wonder, Patrick, if there are a couple of other tensions there that might sort of come to light. One of them is the North-South thing, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the other is, Manchesterism is essentially an urban philosophy. And there was a bit where he talked about putting universities at the heart of communities as they develop. But he also wants to talk about places like Scunthorpe, places like Port Talbot, the kind of sort of, more left behind deindustrialised places. These are not necessarily urban centres. And you do wonder a bit if they're going to get left behind.
Reindustrialisation, that's the third thing number 10 North is going to be doing, Hugo. Reindustrialisation. Yeah, and he also spoke about rural communities. He made a pointed reference to the southwest, power flowing out of Westminster to the south and to the Midlands, as well as to the north. And the thing he said at the start of this speech was the striking thing. He wants to build the broadest possible coalition for change in the country. But that is a political wrinkle, and you're right to put your finger on it. If you're listening to that speech and hearing number 10 North, what Andy Burnham needs to do is, make clear that what's important is the sort of broader economic policy and the priorities, reindustrialisation for some of the places you mentioned, public control of utilities in wherever, rather than the emphasis being on Manchester and the North as he defines it. Because really it's there was a line in there too about London paying the price with an overheated economy and an overcrowded housing market and poor living arrangements for people. I was struck that there wasn't as much as that as I would have thought from the pre-briefing. And I think politically, if he's looking ahead to this brave new world where Labour MPs are going to be encouraged to voice their frustrations and try and have a more collaborative culture, MPs in London and the South East need to be shown quite quickly that there is something in this for them as well. Yeah. And it's not a sort of northern counter-revolution. Listening to what he was saying and the substance, that's why I said it's a subtler speech to give it credit for. There is a lot in there for people, but it will be a question of emphasis, tone and political management.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. That's Patrick Maguire there, the Times' chief political commentator, who I assume is now sort of house hunting for a flat in what I expect will become his new home in Manchester. I'm joined now by Ollie Cole, the Times' newsroom reporter. He's going to be delving into some of the best of the Times you might have missed. Hello, Ollie.
Hello.
So look, starting off, the Times has a poll of Burnham's devolution plans. Tell us what our readers are thinking.
Yes, so we are looking, obviously we've got a live file up right now with all the latest and 1,000 words of Patrick Maguire analysis to come a little bit later on that big speech. But the poll running is whether it's good to give local authorities the power to tackle youth unemployment. Is that a good idea? Currently, 75% of Times readers think it is, against 25% who don't.